Well, I got ordained about 20 years ago now, and for me it was a way to become more relevant, not only socially active and helping people, but trying to have a spiritual life too. I thought it would...
What denomination?
It was a United Church. That's the largest Protestant church in Canada. The government did set it up in 1925. They also gave it the power of a bank when they formed it, the power to lend money, issue promissory notes. So clearly it was set up as a corporation, but also a way to assimilate, that's a polite word for genocide. And the Vatican was the model. All the Protestant churches followed suit, including the way they treated Aboriginal people and the way they murdered them. About 25 years ago, I was working in Vancouver with Native people on the street and saw all the symptoms, all the problems of something really horrendous and nobody wanted to talk about. The death rate still is as high as it ever was in the time of the residential schools among Native people. Everything from the way that Native people are killed regularly by police, forced off their land. Most homeless people in Canada are Native, even though they're only 2% of the population. Half the prison population is Aboriginal. One of the reasons that is the government makes money actually by having Native people in jail, because any money that the government would have given to them reverts to the government if a Native person's in prison. So there's an economic incentive for the government to lock up Indians. The very first Indian I ever spoke to told me that his best friend had been murdered in the United Church residential school when he was a boy, buried in the hills out back. And he claimed that all the church people knew about it, which is why they never invited Native people to come into the church. Because I asked the question, why aren't there any Indians in coming to church when they're about a third of the population? Nobody wanted to say anything about that. So literally every time I visited a Native person, they had a story of someone being killed, children being raped, all that stuff. And I tried to get the church at the time to take an interest, and they pretty much told me to warn me to back off from listening to those stories. The missionaries had been operating for a long time in Canada, and these crimes had been going on, but it received a real impetus when the government authorized these church schools back in the 1890s, and they went on for about a century. The last one didn't close until 1996. Probably half the children died in these places. Over 50,000 children never came back. Native people only own about 1% of the original land that was theirs. And they're on reservations, which are actually owned by the government. The Crown, British Crown, owns all land in Canada under their law. And even on Indian reservations, the Native people just administer the land for the Crown. So they don't even own their own land. And then the Crown would then lease out the land to the churches, who would then sell it off to various, multinationals and that for a lot of money. So it was a big, money-making operation from the beginning. Well, there was, an attempted revolution in Canada in 1837. It was crushed. Basically, in Quebec and Ontario, there were attempts by both French and English-speaking people to throw out the British Crown, establish a republican form of government. And by defeating that, what they did is the Crown established a colonial system of rule, which is still in place now with the Governor-General system and that. It also solidified the power of the Church. So the Roman Catholic Church became the main power in Quebec, and in order to maintain loyalty to the British Crown. So basically it established a feudal system where the churches had absolute control, and that allowed them to run these residential schools and get away with murder for a long time. So it was very linked to the kind of oligarchy that was in place and how that helped this church-administered genocide to occur. In a nutshell, what happened was I was letting people speak from the pulpit about the crimes they'd seen in the residential school, the murders and that. I also found out about the land deals that were happening where the church was selling off native land to big logging companies for kickbacks. And I wrote a letter about that to the church. I was fired without cause and eventually thrown out of the church without any due process at all. But that one thing led to another, and I began to work a lot more with the survivors after that, the eyewitnesses to these crimes. And that's how the world began to learn about all of this stuff. We also found out a history of the land deals that had been going on, where the church had been taking the land they had basically stolen from Native people and selling off to logging companies and others for money kickbacks to the church. Within, about 4 weeks of me writing a letter of concern about that, I was summarily fired from my pulpit without cause and eventually defrocked without any kind of due process. They came in and handed me a letter of dismissal. And I tried appealing it through the courts wouldn't touch it. Basically, I learned that the church is a power unto itself and is not accountable to the civil courts at all. They have their own internal courts to try dissidents. That's a long history of that. So it's kind of ironic, the same system that allowed them to get away with murdering Native children also allowed them to destroy my life and also silence any criticism within the church at all. They approached my wife at the time and offered to help her with her divorce because they said I'd never work again in Canada, which turned out to be true. I'm still under a very severe blacklisting. But in return for helping her with the divorce, she provided them with information and that. So she eventually got custody of my 2 daughters. Well, I think we have to attack directly these oligarchical institutions. You know, for example, people have to disaffiliate from these corporate institutions called the churches. Stop giving money to these institutions. Remove the tax-exempt status under the law for these churches. Make clergy public servants. License them so that if they do commit wrongs, their licenses can be removed. In other words, establish public control over, you know, these really medieval institutions that are powers unto themselves. It's got to happen from the grassroots because the governments, the police, we are totally complicit in this whole history of genocide. We see that in Ireland, Canada, here, the United States. So there's no point going to the wolf and telling it to stop eating sheep, you know. There was a thing called the Nuremberg Legal Conventions in 1950 that the United Nations passed, and it said, even though I don't really trust the United Nations, nevertheless, there was a principle in international law that says if your government or any organization you're part of is engaged in criminal acts, including war against innocent people, you have an obligation not to pay them taxes. We're standing on solid moral and legal ground when we do that. And I say take the money away from the government and the churches and put it back into the community and, I mean, reinvent our society is what you have to do. Canada actually has the highest rate of foreign ownership of any country in the world. Primarily American, but a lot of Chinese investment now. But like here, the Crown claims to own everything. So there's been a movement that developed in Canada 2 years ago to try to establish the Republic of Gov't, which was a Mohawk word meaning, Canada comes from a Mohawk word meaning our home or our village. And basically, it's a movement to disaffiliate ties with the British Crown, to reestablish, you know, public control over the land. And you know, it's got to be at every level. It's a spiritual movement, it's a community-based movement, it's a political movement. You need to operate on all those levels, and you've got to lead by example. This is a very exciting time because in Italy, Germany, Ireland, here, and in America, as well as Canada, we now have a movement developing to confront the Vatican and set up an international tribunal to actually put them on trial. When I come back in September, we're going to be holding more rallies. We're going to be here when the Pope comes and try to perform a citizen's arrest on him. We're going to be holding other events to unite the people who've suffered from the church. This isn't just about Native people or Catholic orphanages in Ireland. This is about children violated systematically over the centuries by these institutions. And they're criminal organizations and they've got to be confronted and disestablished, as I said. So this is part of an international campaign. And the support I've been getting here is unbelievable, actually. Much better than in North America. The media, when we were in Ireland, picketing the Parliament the other day, we were on national radio, television, and the newspapers. That's something you'd never see in Canada or the U.S. We'd never get that kind of coverage. No, this won't go away because the Pope is personally implicated. As far back as 1962, every priest and bishop anywhere in the world in the Catholic Church knew that they were under papal order to suppress evidence of children being abused. So they're all engaged in a criminal conspiracy. It's www.hiddenfromhistory.org, and on there you can see a lot of the evidence that we've accumulated over the years, including our film Unrepentant, which is one of few documentary film awards in America. Anyone can access it on that website, hiddenfromhistory.org. And we encourage people to make copies of it, to take the evidence and use it as a way to get the stories out in your own community, because this is happening all over the world. And the most important thing to do first is to get the survivors to come out and speak and to confront those like Holly Grieg and others who are confronting state-level child trafficking rings here in England. And it's part of the same crime. So hopefully the website will help people to do that, and we encourage people to do their own work.